Hi, my name is Natalie Johnson, and I wrote my speech over the civil rights subculture and social movement. The civil rights movement was a movement started by the African American community during the early 1950s to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans. To be able to understand the ideas, identity, and practices that spawn from the civil rights subculture and social movement, defining the term subculture is necessary. Hainfler describes the term subculture as a relatively diffuse social network having a shared identity, distinctive meanings in certain ideas, practices, and objects, and a sense of marginalization from a resistance to a perceived conventional society. The civil rights subculture and social movement is an important example that demonstrates how subcultures can inspire changes to the justice system and positive social changes. It also demonstrates how a marginalized group of individuals inspire the creation of their own style, music, support system, and subcultural history. The most important aspects of creating subcultures focus around those aspects and the creation of a lifestyle, which Hainfler states as any distinctive mode of living. The civil rights movement began in 1954 and ended in 1968 after successfully establishing a subculture and social movement that would indefinitely carry on and influence future generations to come. Hainfler describes the key concepts of diffuse networks, shared identity, shared distinctive meanings, resistance, and marginalization. The civil rights movement embodied all of these concepts during its decade-long series of events and continues to be an example of how subcultures can become influential, powerful, and create long-lasting effects. The first thing I'd like to discuss is diffuse networks and how the civil rights movement created their own diffuse network. The term diffuse network indicates large numbers of involvement, and the civil rights movement was and is no exception to that rule. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, is a perfect example of how the civil rights movement spawned not only a diffuse but organized network of supporters. The NAACP established its presence nationwide in 1913 and contracted supporters from all around the United States. It has since grown drastically, and according to the NAACP, throughout the 1940s, the NAACP saw enormous growth in membership, recording roughly 600,000 members by 1946. So by that time, they had racked up almost about 500,000 followers. That's pretty impressive. This large network of supporters has only continued, of course, to grow through the years and gain more political and social influence. Next, I'd like to talk about Hainfler's specific definition of a diffuse network, which is different from our original definition of a diffuse network. Hainfler includes in his definition of diffuse networks that subcultures have relatively little formal leadership, bureaucratic organizational structure, membership lists, or rationally planned, legitimated rules as compared to conventional businesses, schools, political parties, and civic groups. The civil rights movement is special in that it contains formal leadership organizations that are structured, as well as informal support from protesters and people who spread the idea of civil rights throughout the social medias and by word of mouth. It's easy to see how this subculture has diffuse networks of both formal and informal leadership and supporters, which is something that I thought was pretty cool. The next subtopic of subculture that I want to discuss regarding the civil rights movement is shared identity. Hainfler describes shared identity as participants that participate in a particular subculture identity with one another and see themselves as different from others, including often other subculturists. This is the biggest aspect of the civil rights movement because shared identity is the basis for large crowds of people pushing for change. The shared identity of the supporters is almost tantamount to pushing this movement and the social movement forward. The difference between having literal shared identities and figurative shared identities will allow us to be able to see how the civil rights movement wasn't and isn't exclusive to just African American supporters. America has always been a melting pot, a place for many different ethnicities, races, and religious beliefs, etc. The biggest accomplishment of the civil rights movement was pushing for the acceptance and equal treatment of African Americans. Regardless of skin tone, ethnicity, and race, the implication was that these many groups were allied in some way, with a shared set of vision or set of qualities that could still combine to create a distinct and unified whole. And I actually grabbed that quote from the Washington Post from an article called "Do Americans Still Have a Shared Identity?" The concept of shared identity exists within the American culture and subculture, figuratively, through shared ideas despite physical likeness of different groups of people, which is the figurative shared identity. This means that all races and ethnicities were and are free to participate in the civil rights movement if they share the same concepts, ideas, and philosophies. Literal shared identity in the civil rights movement is a lot easier to spot because it is based on the similarities that African Americans can draw between themselves, such as skin color, hair texture, and other similarities that can be found in the physical appearance. However, this literal shared identity can also be found through shared experiences, like experiences and encounters with blatant discrimination. Hainfler provides an excellent example of literal shared identity through the body modification subculture. Hainfler states that not just anyone with a tattoo is part of the body modification subculture, which requires those tattoos to be a central part of one's identity. Becoming a part of the literal shared identity has specific requirements, such as identifying with the same physical attributes as other African Americans. However, becoming a part of the figurative shared identity does not have specific physical, literal identities. I have plenty of friends who support the civil rights movement that aren't a part of my literal shared identity, but share the same concepts, ideas, and philosophies with me. We share the same figurative shared identity, which is incredibly important when it comes to banding together for positive change. I've been ostracized before for having large groups of friends outside of my ethnicity and race, but seeing past those initial physical attributes and understanding that there's a deeper connection is what leads to real change. So to summarize, Hainfler suggests that even though individuals have differences, they feel a belonging to a subculture when their ideas align. Hainfler goes on to discuss that having shared distinct meanings is also a part of subcultures, and having shared distinctive meanings almost directly ties into the idea of shared identity. Shared distinctive meanings can be practices, objects, or values and beliefs. Distinctive meanings and figurative shared identity are synonymous for finding similarities and opportunities to discuss and bond over shared concepts, ideas, and philosophies. It is also important to realize that these distinctive meanings could be used to create subcultures inside of the civil rights subculture. For example, there might be a group of activists that go about working together in non-normative ways to reach their goals of activism, therefore separating themselves from the crowd or normative subset of activists. I've been grouped into the non-normative subset of civil rights activists a few times in my life because of my personal beliefs on how things should be accomplished. My approach to activism is a non-violent and peaceful approach. I typically do not condone violence in any way, especially when rights are on the line and establishing respect and gaining it is a major goal. So the civil rights movement was and still is currently focused on gaining the proper respect and acknowledgement for African Americans. I believe that it is contradictory to approach the gaining of rights and respect through violence and through showing that we are incapable of handling our emotions or that we act impulsively. On another note, I am not ignorant to the specific anger and even rage that is associated with being treated differently because of having a specific skin color. I'm also considered to be a part of the non-normative subset because my thinking is different from most others who are around my same age and demographic. As a science major, I tend to analyze things scientifically, and this is no exception to that oddity. Scientifically speaking, melanin is present in all of us despite of our race or ethnicity. The difference between someone with lighter skin and someone with darker skin is the activation of melanocytes, which is something that your body automatically determines based on the environment that you live in and how much protection you need from the sun. So skin color is nothing more than science in my eyes. And I feel especially frustrated that it is and was used to determine the rights that a person could have and is currently still used to determine how we treat people. The civil rights subculture is most notably a course of resistance. Hainfler describes resistance as either active or passive opposition to the normal society and its rules and ideologies. Civil rights activists specifically fought against the discriminatory and racist ideas that society fought so hard to implement. Activists led protests and rallied for change, which eventually led to major legislative changes that were in favor of the civil rights social movement. Actually, government archives show that between 1998 and 1999, legislation changed to enforce a new law that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, which comes from the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we should be familiar with, as well as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This was the biggest accomplishment for the civil rights movement because this was the beginning of the end of legal discrimination. This is easily one of the most important moments in the history of the United States. The legal ban of discrimination and racism allowed for African American individuals and other marginalized groups to begin to experience some of the freedom that whites were able to experience. This was the biggest accomplishment for the civil rights movement and cultures. This is a perfect example of how progressive actions taken on the part of activists led to legislative changes and produced permanent changes. Most importantly, this change led to the disassembly of marginalization and its negative impacts on society. The disassembly of marginalization and its negative impacts on society inevitably helped to create a safer and more enjoyable environment in the United States for heavily marginalized groups. Inevitably, this led to the redefining of the term subculture and began to incorporate more diverse meanings. Hainfler suggests that a subculture is not a thing, not an immediately recognizable group, but rather a set of diverse meanings and practices that change over time. We're able to understand how consistent and present activism through the civil rights movement led to not only permanent changes in the African American community, but change America's view of marginalization and subcultures forever. Overall, the civil rights movement is a perfect example of subcultures and how their key concepts change and evolve constantly. Resistance, marginalization of groups involved, distinctive meanings, and shared identity play a huge role in defining subcultures and their goals. In the end, the civil rights movement subculture was almost solely responsible for the positive changes in the justice system and society that we see today when examining African American rights. Today, activism continues, and the subculture continues to flower into its own individual branches that will eventually form their own distinct subcultures. Thank you.